The house did not look evil. That was its first and most effective trick. Truly dangerous places rarely announce themselves with drama. They don't scream on the first night. They don't throw shadows on the walls for theatrical effect, and they certainly don't warn you at the door. They let you move in. They let you unpack. They let you believe you made a smart decision. And only then do they begin to participate. In 1986, the Snedeker family was not hunting ghosts, demons, or metaphysical experiences. They were hunting affordability, space, proximity to a hospital. Alan Snedeker was dying of cancer, and cancer has a way of shrinking the moral and emotional universe until only logistics remain. When survival becomes the daily objective, symbolism loses its urgency. Even the kind of symbolism soaked into the walls of a former funeral home. The house was large, suspiciously large for the price. Thick walls, old structure, generous rooms, and a basement that seemed designed for work rather than comfort. The real estate agent mentioned its past almost as an afterthought, the way one might mention a previous paint color or a remodeled kitchen. Yes, it had once been a funeral home. No, that shouldn't matter anymore. Business is close. Buildings change purpose. Death, apparently, was expected to respect zoning laws. They moved in. For a while, nothing happened, which only strengthened the illusion that this story would be boring. The silence felt heavy, but old houses are quiet in strange ways. The air in certain rooms felt dense, but stress can do that to perception. There were faint odors now and then, metallic and vaguely chemical, but everyone assumed age was the culprit. Old pipes, old wood, old memories, if one were feeling poetic. Nothing that justified panic. Nothing that couldn't be ignored. Then the dreams started. Not symbolic dreams or fragmented anxiety narratives, but vivid, intrusive scenes that left the body exhausted upon waking. Sexual, violent, uninvited. Most unsettling was not their content, but their consistency. Different people, same atmosphere. The shared sensation that something had been present. Psychology has vocabulary for this. Trauma, stress, displacement anxiety. The brain is remarkably creative when under pressure. Unfortunately, creativity does not usually rearrange furniture. The basement slowly became the emotional center of gravity, drawing attention without invitation. It was colder there. Always. The smell lingered no matter how much it was cleaned. Faint stains remained on the floor where embalming tables once stood. Outlines of labor that had nothing to do with life. This was the place where bodies had been drained, opened, chemically altered, and restored for display. Repetition gives meaning weight, and this basement had hosted death not as an event, but as routine. Sounds emerged when no one was there. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, as if whoever walked wanted to be heard. Rhythmic knocking that suggested impatience rather than randomness. Objects moved, first subtly, then with intent. One of the children reported being touched while asleep. Not vaguely, not imaginatively, specifically. Another began displaying violent mood shifts and sexual aggression entirely foreign to his previous behavior. Psychiatry would call it dissociation. Neurology might suggest stress-induced impulse disruption. Both would require time, therapy, and distance from the stimulus. The house, however, showed no interest in cooperation. Alan deteriorated faster than his doctors could comfortably explain. Pain surfaced without clinical cause. Emotional volatility escalated. A constant sensation of being watched settled into his nervous system like a permanent infection. The more frightened the family became, the more active the house appeared. An almost elegant feedback loop. Fear-feeding response. Response feeding fear. Psychologists refer to this as negative reinforcement. Older traditions use language that modern science prefers not to validate. Desperation does not destroy rationality. It simply forces it to expand its borders. When conventional explanations fail to produce relief, people look elsewhere, not because they abandon logic, but because logic has stopped being useful. That is how the names Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren entered the Snedeker household. Not as saviors, but as specialists in situations everyone else quietly avoided. Lorraine stepped into the basement and did not speak of ghosts or emotional residue. She used a colder, less comforting word. This was not a haunting. It was an infestation. And infestations, unlike memories, do not fade on their own. The Warrens did not arrive expecting to be impressed. By the mid-1980s, they had already learned a fundamental rule of abnormal environments. Truly dangerous places do not perform on command. They don't erupt the moment an investigator walks in, and they don't escalate simply because someone brought a notebook, a Bible, or a tape recorder. If anything, they tend to grow quieter, more observant, as if evaluating the newcomers the same way the newcomers evaluate them. This house behaved exactly like that. It did not react to the Warrens with hostility or fear. It reacted with patience. Ed Warren approached the situation the way he always did. Pragmatically, almost mundanely. He listened more than he spoke, took notes, asked the same questions multiple times, and paid close attention to inconsistencies. Contrary to popular myth, Ed was less interested in phenomena than in patterns. What he found unsettling about the Snedeker case was not the severity of the reports, but their coherence. The activity wasn't scattered. It wasn't random. It clustered neatly around moments of weakness, illness, sleep, emotional distress, adolescence. If this were a psychological feedback loop, it was a disturbingly efficient one. If it were something else, then efficiency was an even worse sign. Lorraine Warren never needed to ask as many questions. She reacted almost immediately, not with panic, but with physical discomfort. Entering the house felt, to her, like stepping into a space that had already decided what it wanted from its occupants. Lorraine was careful with language. She avoided the theatrical. She didn't describe a demon pacing the halls or a spectral figure looming in the corners. What she described instead was pressure, layers of impressions stacked on top of each other, as if the house were less a location and more an archive. Not memories, exactly. More like habits. The basement was where the subtlety collapsed. Lorraine's reaction there was immediate and involuntary. Nausea, dizziness. A sharp spike of anxiety that had nothing to do with darkness or imagination. She later spoke of intrusive images that did not feel symbolic or dreamlike. Not metaphors. Procedures. Bodies laid out. Repetition without reverence. Death processed efficiently, impersonally, and often. The uncomfortable implication was not that something evil had happened there once, but that something impersonal had happened there hundreds of times. Ritual requires belief. Routine does not. Ed reached his conclusion with a term that sounds almost disappointingly clinical. Infestation. Not possession. Not haunting. Infestation implies occupation without consent and without identity. It suggests something that does not care who you are, only that you are available. This distinction mattered. A haunting might seek acknowledgement or resolution. An infestation simply persists. It does not negotiate. It does not leave because you asked nicely. The recommended response followed predictably. Clergy were contacted. Prayers were spoken. Blessings were performed. Holy water was applied with the optimistic confidence that something ancient would respect modern ceremony. For brief periods, activity subsided. Just long enough to create hope. Then it returned with more intensity, as if irritated by the interruption. Skeptics later pointed out that expectation can shape perception, that rituals heighten anxiety, and that heightened anxiety produces heightened experiences. This explanation works beautifully, until the house begins to behave as though it has preferences. Objects moved more violently after religious interventions. Sounds grew louder. Sleep paralysis episodes intensified. Sexual aggression escalated in ways that strained even the most generous psychological interpretations. If this were a case study in mass hysteria, it was one with remarkably consistent timing and escalation. Fear did not dissipate with reassurance. It responded to resistance. Inside the family, cohesion began to fracture. Arguments intensified. Paranoia crept in. Trust eroded not because anyone was lying, but because no one could prove they weren't. The house functioned less like a backdrop and more like a catalyst, accelerating every existing fault line. Alan's health declined sharply. Not just physically, but emotionally. Pain without cause. Rage without target. A constant sense of violation that medicine could not comfortably diagnose. Lorraine warned that prolonged exposure could result in permanent psychological damage. Ed, less poetic, simply advised leaving. Leaving sounds simple in retrospect. It rarely is. By the time the family moved out, the damage had already been done. Trauma does not respect addresses. Some effects followed them. Behavioral disturbances lingered. Sleep remained fractured. Critics later argued that the Warrens had reframed stress as the supernatural, that they had given fear a narrative and therefore power. Supporters countered that the fear predated the narrative and merely found language through it. Both sides missed the same uncomfortable point. Explanation does not equal resolution. Years later, the case would be formalized, cataloged, and sold to the public through In a Dark Place. Readers would argue over credibility. Scholars would dissect methodology. Skeptics would mock. Believers would nod. The house itself remained uninterested in the debate. Buildings do not require consensus. They only require occupants. What lingered was not a demon with a name, but a question modern culture prefers not to answer. Whether environments shaped by prolonged exposure to death, detachment, and routine violation of the human body remain neutral once their purpose changes. Whether some places learn patterns the way people do, and whether, once learned, those patterns need belief at all. Leaving the house was supposed to be the ending. That was the version everyone preferred. The clean arc, the moral punctuation mark at the end of a deeply uncomfortable paragraph. Move out, move on, heal. Reality, unfortunately, has never been obligated to respect narrative satisfaction. The Snedeker family didn't leave with closure. They left with after effects. And after effects are the one thing no moving truck can carry away. Life outside the house resumed in the way damaged systems usually do. Unevenly, unreliably, and with long stretches of forced normality punctuated by relapse. Sleep remained fractured. Emotional volatility lingered. Certain behaviors, especially those that had emerged under that roof, did not evaporate simply because the physical proximity had ended. Psychology has a perfectly adequate explanation for this. Once fear rewires perception, the body continues to react long after the stimulus disappears. The supernatural explanation, if one insists on entertaining it, is less polite. Either way, the result is the same. The experience did not ask permission to stay. What followed was not catharsis, but interpretation. And interpretation requires an audience. Years later, the case was shaped, organized, and preserved in a Dark Place, a title that quietly promised readers something the actual events never offered. Definition. The book did what such accounts are designed to do. It imposed order. It gave fear a spine. It transformed an ongoing psychological and emotional collapse into a sequence with a beginning, middle, and implied end. Not because the truth demanded it, but because readers do. Predictably, the reaction fractured along familiar lines. Skeptics dissected inconsistencies with surgical enthusiasm, pointing to suggestion, stress, financial motivation, and the known unreliability of memory under trauma. Believers countered with the severity of reported events, the behavioral changes, and the pattern of escalation. Both sides argued as though accuracy alone could retroactively heal damage. Both sides missed the same quiet conclusion. Explanation is not the same as repair. The Warrens themselves became part of the unresolved equation. To some, they were investigators willing to step where institutions refused to follow. To others, they were narrators who gave fear a mythology and therefore momentum. The truth, as usual, sat uncomfortably between those extremes. They did not invent the suffering in that house. They also did not erase it. What they provided was language. And language, while powerful, is not neutral. The house continued to exist, as houses do. It did not collapse into itself out of guilt. It did not seal its doors in shame. Eventually, it found new occupants. Walls were repainted. Spaces redefined. Basements cleaned and rebranded. No widely documented outbreak of paranormal chaos followed, which skeptics cite as vindication and believers explain away with equal confidence. The house remained silent, which may be the most unsettling outcome of all. Silence, after all, does not mean absence. It means no one is listening closely enough. What this case ultimately resists is comfort. If it was psychological, then it demonstrates how illness, environment, and sustained stress can create experiences indistinguishable from possession. If it was something else, then it suggests that places can become participants, rather than settings, shaped by repetition until they develop behavioral inertia. Neither conclusion flatters the human need for control. Both suggest that context matters far more than intention. Perhaps that is why the Snedeker case refuses to die quietly. Not because it proves demons exist, but because it exposes a far less cinematic truth. That damage does not require belief. That environments carry momentum. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing a place can do is continue behaving exactly as it was conditioned to behave, long after everyone insists it shouldn't. And if this story lingers uncomfortably, if it leaves you less reassured than you expected, that reaction is not accidental. It is the same instinct that keeps people listening when the rational explanation feels incomplete. The same instinct that drives us to revisit stories like this, not for answers, but for pattern recognition. So if you find yourself compelled to stay, to follow these threads further, to examine other cases where the line between mind and environment dissolves just enough to be disturbing, then you already understand the point. Some stories are not meant to be finished. They are meant to be continued. By attention, by curiosity, and by those willing to keep listening when the house has stopped speaking.